As the internet or cyber world becomes more accessible to younger people, it's not surprising that cyberbullying is also having an impact on people who are often too young to understand the implications. International research shows that victims of cyberbullying are taking their own lives in increasing numbers, and that's also happening here in New Zealand. That trend is of great concern not only to our Prime Minister, but also our Chief Coroner, Judge Neil Maclean, who strongly suggests that teenagers might think more carefully about taking such drastic action if there was more public discussion about suicide and the devastating impact it has on family and friends. Judge Maclean spoke with Alan Lee.
Well, Judge Maclean, our suicide statistics in this country are particularly bad. We're among the worst in the Western world. Have you any idea why that is?
Partly it's because we are very open about the true picture in New Zealand. Having a modern, reformed coronial system means that no suicide slips sort of between the cracks. Without disparaging other countries are less open about it, partly because it's still a taboo topic, or it may even be a crime. But certainly it can have bad consequences for family in terms of estates and that sort of thing.
Well, one of the things that as reporters we're always told is that we should never say it's a suicide unless a coroner says it's a suicide. And even after the coroner says it's a suicide, we shouldn't talk about details or anything that can talk about what actually happened in case it persuades someone else to do the same thing.
It's the second bit that's changing. The first bit that you were taught is still correct, and that's still what the law is, that until a coroner's made a decision or a coroner's given permission, nobody should say, use the word suicide, be it presumed suicide, assumed suicide, or talk about what happened. And that is an area where some media are still breaking the law, in my view, and quite seriously. The other side of the coin is that I'm encouraging my coroners and general public debate that even though the law says after a coroner's held an inquest or made a finding, he or she should not allow publication of anything other than the bare name, occupation and finding was self-inflicted. Unless satisfied, it will do no harm. The coroners turn that round and say, if there are some lessons to be learned here, if there's information the public need to know, think about whether that would actually do some good. And if you feel that that meets that test, then allow it to be published.
That's certainly been the case though in the past, hasn't it, that we've been very reluctant to talk about suicide.
It's one of those topics like family violence that we really was kind of hidden from public view. It wasn't a nice thing to talk about. It's one of the last kind of taboos because it's such a personal thing. But we can't ignore the reality. 540 deaths a year, half as much again as the road toll. We can't just ignore that elephant in the room. It's a reality, it's a highly unpalatable fact, but I think and I sense the public say, look, we're worried about this. Tell us more about it. We need to know, how can we help? What are the signs we should be looking for? That sort of thing.
I think one of the reasons though that we're not very keen to talk about it, that we're frightened about talking about it, is because there will be a grieving family involved, and you don't want to open those floodgates of grief, and so we're frightened.
I think so. I mean, it's never easy when someone's husband, friend dies. It takes a bit of courage sometimes to actually front up and acknowledge that this has happened. And I know, grieving people say they struggle with the fact that the last thing anybody talks about is the fact that my husband died. It's a major thing in my life. It happened. Please don't pretend it didn't happen.
Well, I think it's sadly the case that many of us know, we either know someone or we know someone who knows someone who has committed suicide, who has taken their own life.
Certainly, and the considerable increase in young Maori teenage suicide.
Any idea why?
No.
One of the things we've heard a lot about in recent months is people who've taken their own lives as a result of being bullied in cyberspace. And it's maybe the anonymity of cyberspace, Facebook and Twitter, that encourages people to bully others. Have you been conscious of that?
Yes, the anonymity and the sheer volume and rapidity of it. And there's a whole area that adults don't know anything about. Many parents have no idea what their children are doing in cyberspace, who it is they're talking to, what information they're getting. And yes, coroners have been picking up situations where cyberbullying has been a factor in the background. Bullying's been a fact of life, I think, ever since Adam. And that's just the way humans are. But cyberbullying seems to be more insidious because it can go on 24/7, and there's sometimes a ganging up process goes on, and it's not immediately apparent. Friends may well not know what's going on. Parents won't know what's going on. And a child struggling, particularly in the teenage years, to cope with growing up, really alone at night, picking up this information, are particularly vulnerable. And one or two coroners have commented about that. Often with the parents who've been sitting listening to all this saying, we want people to know because we don't want other parents to go through the same thing.
So is this where the coronial system can actually be a help?
That's what coroners do. Tell people these are the facts, folks, like it or not. This is what happened, this is how it happened, this is who it happened to, and as best we can, this seems to be why it happened. And if sometimes we can say, from what I've seen and the evidence I've received, I can see a way that this could be prevented in the future, then we'll say it, make a recommendation.
So what reaction are you getting from the rest of the judicial system as far as talking about suicide more is concerned? What's their reaction to your proposals?
From the rest of the judicial system, I think the judicial system, both here, England, Australia, and the legal profession still struggle to understand exactly how different the coronial system is. It's an inquisitorial system driven by a judicial officer deciding where the inquiry will go, as opposed to the mainstream judicial system, which is whatever the parties want to put before the judge, that's what the judge hears. The judge doesn't really have a say in who he or she will hear from. The coroner does. I often describe it as an inquisitorial cuckoo in an adversarial nest.
And what's their reaction to talking about suicide more?
Wholehearted support, particularly the judges who are operating in much the same area of your youth court judges and family court judges, almost without exception, will say to me, we like what you're doing, we applaud what you're doing, it resonates with us, you're dealing with the same sort of people we're dealing with, all credit to you.
The figures seem to go up. We're always hearing that it's getting worse than it ever was. Is there an epidemic?
People sometimes have a perception that there's suddenly a plague or an epidemic. In fact, if you look at the graphs over the last 5 years, which is the period I've been in office, it's almost exactly the same this year as it was 5 years ago. It's just it shifts around a bit in the cohorts, in either the age range or there's certain common factors. It's males 3 to 1. The Maori rate is considerably higher than the general European rate or the Asian rate. So there's a few common factors. And even though you look at a graph and it looks like a mountain range, down 1 month, up the next, the mean, the average line is almost dead flat.
I guess one of the things that comes out of this is that it's not just the coroners, but also particularly dealing with the aftermath of a suicide. You're dealing with the health services, the emergency services, the police. It's going to take a multi-pronged approach.
It is, and I've just come from an all-day meeting with a wider group of Auckland professionals in mental health, child, youth and family, victim support, police, you name it. And what we've been talking about is what we call postvention, the response particularly to a young person's suicide, because the thinking is we can do a lot better there. Because when one young person in a school environment or any close environment commits suicide, the ripple effect of that is the same for everybody else. Probably because all their peers and friends are also on the social media networks, rumours spread like wildfire. And we know there is what they call a contagion effect. Those amongst that group of peers and friends who could be geographically hundreds of miles away, the vulnerable ones there, who see the glorification that is described, the big tangi, the big funeral, the celebrating the life, etc., etc., etc. Sometimes that seems to be enough to tip them over to think, well, that's not such a bad thing to do. Completely illogical, and not under, if you're not depressed or, and you're in control of your life, you can't understand that. But it is a phenomenon, we see it going on. So there's a big push on here in Greater Auckland, in fact Bombay's north, to try and pilot a scheme for much more effective coordinated intervention, to get teams into the schools to provide expert advice to the often harassed school counsellor, often very isolated, or the local pastor, or the people struggling to deal with it, who don't know where to go from help, don't know what the right thing to do is.
How hard is it for you and your fellow coroners? Because when you guys see all of this, you see all the grief, you see all the stories coming before you. How do you cope with it?
Just like any other judicial officer does. Basically, the end of the day, it's a job. You apply all your skills to it. You've got to stay objective, hard though that may be, because you're no use to anyone if you become a blubbering wreck. People are looking to you to just steer them through the process. And I think that's where the job satisfaction of a coroner will come, because unlike other judicial officers who basically their job is, in the criminal context, to punish and to condemn, our job is actually to help the survivors, help the bereaved through the process, help them to find the answers that they're sometimes looking for. Common thing with a suicide, why did this happen to our son? Where did we go wrong? What might we have done differently? Should we blame ourselves? All those sorts of things. We can walk people through that, find out what really happened, not just in suicides, but all types of either unexplained deaths. And that you're dealing not with one particular group of society. You're actually dealing with rich, poor, fit, young, old, the whole gamut of society. And most people are remarkably resilient and remarkably understanding and accepting of the process. My aim is to try and make that not user-friendly, but as helpful and as non-interventionist as we possibly can, which means we look at things as, is there really need to be a post-mortem examination done here? Do we really need to have a public inquest, or could it just be dealt with on the papers, which increasingly with suicide we are now doing?
Thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure. Pleasure.
Alan Lee talking there with Chief Coroner Judge Neil McLean. And if that interview has raised any issues for you and you'd like to know who you could talk to, we have a list available of organizations which could be helpful. You'll find those details on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/EndZoneTonight in the EndZone Focus section right under our interview with Judge Neil McLean. So do please get in touch with those organizations if you'd like to know more information.